the theory that first got us together was the Strauss and Howe fourth turning theory, which basically subscribes to the idea that every 20 years there's a new era and a new generational cohort
Yeah.
that is born and reacting to the previous.
Right.
And basically, there are four types that are going on and over again for approximately 80 years, which
Right.
equals to a cycling. I pitched that in a better way, but it's
Right.
but that's basically the gist of it. And the theory by Strauss and Howe, I think, they have several books. Started with Generations, which was in the early 90s. The Fourth Turning book, The 13th Generation, which deals with Generation X, Millennial Ryen. And they had a big forum that came out of the early age of the internet that got a lot of people together, like David Kaiser, who is one of our friends and a person that we frequently post with and writes with Time. Basically, the forum got a lot of people together, fans of the Fourth Turner theory, to discuss ideas. And then in the wake of the disintegration of that forum is the Facebook forum that you and I moderate together, admin together with a few other people. So backtrack to then what my initial point is. There's the Strauss and Howe theory, which does have, I think it's a little bit more concrete. It's a very abstract theory, but they also, the fans of the 4T really push hard dates onto it. I'm not even sure the actual writers are that hard on their dates. I don't really get that impression from Neil Howe, the private writer, Strauss, one of the other writers who passed away. But the fans definitely subscribe to hard dates. And so any opposition to those dates usually creates a firestorm. And research is one of the opposition.
Right.
And the thing with Pew Research is I don't really feel that Pew has hard dates either. They're pretty open. They didn't even name the post-millennial generation. They called it,
right.
It's called Gen Z. Like everyone, they just said post-millennial, and they just said it's basically up in the air until the generation comes of age. So, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and that's just mainly because they wait for the actual data to come in. So when they do finally come up with a date, it's probably going to be a lot later than what a lot of other people will do. Personally, I don't really have a problem with that. I mean, I'm not a huge stickler as far as getting into the generations and the
history, like you said,
all that stuff. I come at it more from the historical and political science perspective.
And so from the lens of the 4T, Strauss and Howe, how is history viewed?
So they view it as and it's kind of weird because I'm going to put my political scientist hat on for a second here. Normally, the way we view a theory, you come up with a hypothesis, so something testable. You say, you ask a question, and then you have a set of methods that you can employ in order to answer that question. And one of the sort of criticisms is that there's not really a way to definitively test the theory, I guess. There's nothing you can really do to ask, okay, how would we know that this theory is wrong, I guess. And the theory is that a big basis of it is those 4 generational archetypes, which is essentially, you have your, I'll start with the civic archetype.
Yeah.
Your civics who are in young adulthood, and they name out 4 stages. There's childhood, young adulthood, adulthood, and then elderhood. And they do, I think it's 0 to 20, 21 to 42, 43 to 64, and then 65 and up is how they organize those.
And it goes way back to what, Joan of Arc? Yeah, at least
Yeah, it goes back, I think,
it,
until right after I want to say the Black Plague in
the
the,
authors back history into their hypothesis. Is that what you're?
right.
Okay.
Yeah, they claim there's, evidence of generations having distinct, I guess you could say, almost personalities or tendencies. Like the millennials, they categorize my generation as being, uh, civic in nature.
Hmm.
And then the generation before us, Generation X, they define them as nomads, which they say as children, they're latchkey kids. They grow up during a time where society's not really, um, they're not overly protective of kids. They leave the door unlocked and they want to just be home before basically everybody goes to bed.
Examples of nomads would be like the lost generation that came of age
Yep.
during World War One, and they were
Right.
in their 20s during, well, a little bit, maybe not 20s, but they were basically young adults during the Roaring 20s.
Right.
Um,
Right. And while they were children, I mean, that coincided with like labor, as far as like factory work with kids.
mhm.
They grew up during a time where, of course, they still had kids working in factories, and so sort of them and Generation X, their childhood, as in the context of the times, very similar in that regard.
Under unprotected childhood creates a little hardened uh,
Yeah.
personality, or
Yeah, they use the word jaded.
yeah,
I guess some people would. Yeah, I'd say people would probably agree with that. Generation X, I know generally they had the reputation of being slackers. When they were
yeah,
children or
but
teenagers
possibly,
or adults.
but possibly good managers
Right,
during times of crisis.
right, right. Yeah.
Cowboys during the Great Frontier era. I would say
Mhm.
most westerns, the typical the Western archetype of the cowboy, that really feels nomadic to me.
Yeah, it's like the rugged
Yeah,
individualist.
right.
Yep. And
And
so
something
before,
I would categorize me as a nomad just because I was born in 1981. Um,
right.
because their nomads start in 61 to 81. So Barack Obama to my year. That's in opposition of Pew Research, which starts it. Their start date for millennial was 81. So, but
Right.
that's different. Let's go on. We'll get to
Right. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
deconstruction of each type.
Right.
Nomad, and then after nomad,
And then you have the. It's funny. I'm actually working in reverse
I
here,
just
but
realized that as we talk. Yeah, but we naturally do that. Have you noticed?
yeah,
I always think nomad after us, millennial.
and and it's just because I guess I'm like, oh, I'm a millennial, so I just
Yeah,
work where I am and I work backwards.
right.
But
Because we
before,
really don't know the generation that comes after us.
right, it's not
It-
well defined
yeah,
because they're not even really young adults yet. They're just getting to that point.
and the ones that are, and meanwhile, the ones that are existing from the previous, when I'm jump starting, they're pretty much dying out. But we'll get to
Right.
that later. So,
Right.
so we start off with civic.
Right.
We're going backwards to nomad, which is after, and then after nomad is, or
Is
before nomad.
is the prophet archetype, which the baby boomers have, which through the name, they call them ideological warriors. You think of any major fight between, the right and the left in this country. A lot of people would say that a lot of boomers come to mind, regardless of what political end of the spectrum they're on.
Hmm.
Think of these very strongly ideological people, and I guess in terms of politics, that would be like Newt Gingrich during the 90s, even Mitt Romney, the whole Reaganism thing where,
Hmm.
greed is good, and just really pushing the ability of what an individual can do.
Hmm.
That's sort of a lot of people would say in terms of politics.
And that's our boomers. Obviously, overall, it's whatever idealism that they come
Mhm.
up with during their coming of age,
Right,
like a
right.
vision of the world. Our current prophets, I think, view this
Yeah,
individualized libertarian maybe
Right.
libertarian's not the good word because I don't want to subscribe it to
Yeah.
politics, but
Right. Yeah.
free
I
thinking.
mean, people's political attitudes are pretty much solidified during their, I think they said between the ages of 14 and 25. Or like,
which was the 1960s
yeah.
and 70s.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
they were basically reacting to a very turbulent awakening that was
Right.
spiritual and dealt with civil rights and equality.
Right.
And so they came of age during a time that they were able to have that imprint on them.
Right.
I don't think
And
they were the forefathers
yeah.
of it, but we'll get there.
Right. So, of course, pretty much without exception from childhood all the way up to adulthood, they kind of, stay in the limelight because they're the children that immediately follow the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Strauss and Howe in the theory, they're defined as being sort of precocious, kind of like have it my way or the highway, because the entire time that they live their lifetimes, there's nothing to the scale of a world war until really towards the end of their life. And it comes as a result of them sort of coming to a deadlock as far as their ideology is concerned.
On the gentle side, we have Steven Spielberg, though.
Right.
He was probably a very good example for profit in the industry that I work in, the film and television industry. Just that vision, that romanticized, epic vision.
Right.
It's just so, the world is so idealized that it hurts your teeth.
Right.
But it's also powerful enough that everyone after that plays from that blueprint, from that vision. So that's the big side of the profit. FDR's profit too.
Yeah, and even I'll throw her out there. Oprah.
Oprah.
We're talking about like iconoclasts, like people were. When you think of particular individuals, a boomer will pop up in your mind. A prophet archetype.
There's like a spiritual fire with everything, no matter what, left, right, whatever industry. There seems to be a spiritual fire,
right,
back in them.
Yep. So that's pretty much the boomers. And then before them, you have the silent generation, which are the artist archetype. Now, in the group over the years, we don't. There are some areas where there's a little bit of, I think, wiggle room in there, because on one hand, the silence, there's always this. I think it's an old New York Times piece from either the late 40s or the early 50s that talks about how the graduating class has no edge to them. They just follow all the rules, and they're now becoming adults. And I can't remember.
Society's always hating on teenagers. First they're slackers, then they're entitled. And these guys were just so bad because they just were silent.
Right.
Like it was the 1950s that they came of age. What are they going to complain about? I guess the Cold War maybe, but.
Yeah. And the idea is that we're coming off of a crisis era. And so the young adults, they're just following the rules because, in terms of the government, order is very strong.
Conformity.
Crisis. We're talking about post-Civil War. We're talking Reconstruction and troops being deployed in the South. Post-World War II, everybody is served in the military. Very orderly way of conducting yourself in public. People are having, a lot of kids, so family is a huge thing. Immediately following a crisis, and so.
And they pretty much inherit a pretty peaceful, quote, world. This is not factoring civil rights.
Yeah.
Because I was talking about problems to rebel about and civil rights, but that's later.
Right. Now, it is a little bit. There's a little bit of conflict in there because, there are some silence, especially within music, who, I wouldn't define them as that at all. I think this is just a view of, I guess, the generation as a whole, rather than looking at leaders. of the generation. That's sort of the way I reconcile those two things.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then of course, you go before that, that's the GI generation, and then it repeats. So back to the civics.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of the four archetypes and just examples of throughout history of why Strauss and Howe define those four archetypes.
Dominant and recessive archetypes.
Right. And the dominant ones being, of course, the prophets and the civics, because they typically have bigger generations.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of people in the group, I mean, I looked at the Wikipedia page and all of that. I haven't actually really looked back to see if, I know they argue that even before the Civil War and, you know, going all the way back to whenever they start tracing this, I'm not sure it's actually the case that they're all dominant in the way that, say, the boomers are now or the GIs were.
Well, one wasn't. Apparently, the civics during the Civil War era were not dominant. In fact,
Right.
Strauss and Howe
Right.
said they don't exist. There's an anomaly. So
yeah, and you know, anytime I see an anomaly, I mean, you know, I
conveniently.
side-eyed it a little bit. I'm like, okay, you know, what happened in the research for that? So
Maybe they all went west.
right.
They all went west.
One of the criticisms is, I mean, Al Gore, there's something to this just because, for example, Al Gore, he sent a book out to every member of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
He read, you know, Generations and all that. So, I mean, there, one side of me, I mean, people like talking about generations just like they like talking about, you know, personalities. And
Mm-hmm.
I know, you know, you talk about MBTI a lot, the Myers-Briggs types and all of that. And similarly, you know, in
What's your sign again? Okay.
yeah, we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But the idea of like what defines a generation or not, it's, I don't know, it's kind of amorphous, I guess. It's hard to come up with. You remember that article you sent me? I believe it was about 1 or 2 weeks ago, where the guy in it, he actually moves, I think, all the start dates back like 9 years or something. I think it was like it might have been a Forbes article or something.
That sounds like a great article. I send you so many articles.
Yeah, I'll have to pull it back up. But one of the criticisms of the theory is that it's overly broad.
Mm-hmm.
For example, with millennials. Yeah. And of course, one of the things is, you know, generations initially, their big use was in marketing. And so that's one thing where it makes it easy to sort of, you know, sell products and, you know.
You don't want to make it prophetic. You don't want it to get caught up in boomer prophecy. It's not predictive.
Right.
Some would say pseudoscience. That's what they said about Bannon.
Right. And Bannon, you know, the theory can easily be taken to a point where you say, again, that prophetic thing where you just sort of group everything together in easy categories, and there aren't, you don't take race into account, which we have a whole side theory, because when we look through African American history, it's not quite as clean as far as like the reactions to events.
I want Cole in that discussion.
Yeah, he's much better with the dates on that one.
Mm-hmm.
But just looking at things like the 1970s, as I was listening to, I think it was the People's History of the United States, the audiobook for that. And one of the sort of statistics in it was that by 1978, we had over 2,000 Black, you know, government officials, elected representatives throughout the United States, where I believe in 1965, we only had something like 70. So you could see how for the Black community, that would be considered sort of a high, and obviously post the civil rights movement thing. Now I'm getting into turnings here.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that is typical of a crisis period is that political institutions transform drastically, and we see that still happening for the Black community through the 60s and really into the 70s.
Right.
As far
Definitely the 70s.
yeah.
I mean, that's when
Definitely.
we had so many enter the field as mayors in many major cities across the country.
Yeah, I mean, in DC, of course, our mayor, that was huge, Marion Bailey.
Yeah, Barry.
Barry, there we go. Sorry.
Yeah, I was a kid. I just remember the controversy. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
My first entry into politics is just the controversy from Barry to Monica Lewinsky gate.
Right. Yeah, and so
Scary.
there's a lot going on there, and I'm sure it's sort of, I mean, just seeing the demographic trends for the, for the Latinx community,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure if we go through their history as well, we're going to find trends that don't look quite as clean as simply, there was a high where things were really orderly and good, because one thing is that during a high period crisis, there's usually a group of people that there's sort of a consensus that, hey, these are going to be our second-class citizens until another major crisis. And that's not really something that's I guess, sussed out in the theory so much. And just as you start breaking stuff down into socioeconomic class and all these other measures, then the theory, you start asking, does race have more to do with the response to World War II or whatever? Because with the GI Bill and a lot of the government programs, they initially weren't applied to African Americans. Like when you look at a lot of the big pieces of policy throughout American history, sometimes, and for a large part of history, because of how, just how this country was back then, you get different responses to different events, and it's not so clean. And now with, back then the population being over 80%, white, versus now where it's going to be half that, in another, I believe it was about in like 2012 or 2013. That was the first year where half of the babies born were, or less than half, were majority white. And so it's one of those things where we don't know how, because of the stratification between like race and social class, we don't know if what that does as far as like the turnings and how we respond to crises and all of that.
Well, actually, just you talking actually made me realize what happens. So we have the major crisis where the world is fighting each other, is everybody's pouncing on each other. And I would say what helps to usher in the 1T is that people are just tired.
Right.
They're like, you know what, let's just like all the problems, all the things that divided us, remember how the 20s when we were talking about lynching people and stuff like that? Let's just brush that aside. So let's let's conform to this idea,
Right.
and make things happy, peaceful. And so maybe it's that like that brushing aside, that forced conformity, and ignoring the marginalized groups that actually just creates a 2T, a second turner that just boils out the pot. That's the 2Ts initially basically a response to people ignoring certain aspects.
Right. Yeah. And we talked about how, the turnings, or, the first one immediately following the crisis, is called a high period. And we talked about how that's not necessarily a way to define it. It's more like it's a consensus.
Consensus recovery, yeah.
Right, a recovery, yeah, that might even be more accurate, because really the World War II was a huge kind of aberration where every other country except for us just really, took a lot of damage during the World War, because we had the benefit of being geographically located where we were, and also coming in relatively late, to the party. We didn't sustain the same types of losses that, the Soviet Union did, or Japan, all of Western Europe. And so that's a little bit actually of a rarity, I think.
Corona is the closest, besides Civil War, Corona is like one of the most recent examples of a major crisis happening on our soil.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Nothing else really comes to mind. I mean, before now, 9/11 was the last time that we had deaths.
Yeah.
This side. Yeah.
80 years ago, you have 1940, which led to the Pearl Harbor moment. Think, gosh, what event could make people give up their civil liberties the way they did? And we saw that after 9/11, and we're seeing it now. I'm not making a judgment on that, because it gets to the point where you have to do that in order to fight the villain of the time, or the whatever's threatening society. we have to create social distancing.
Yeah. And I mean, it's defined as an existential threat.
Yeah.
And every time we do this, typically the executive, they gain more power, but we sort of grant it to them. Sort of getting into Corona a little bit and how that relates to it. The thing I'm interested to see is there is always this little bit of tug of war between, states' rights, states exerting executive, their authority, like governors, federal government. Now, every time we've had that conflict, there's a concept in political science. It's the major political cleavages. And one of the there's like 4 of them, and one of the major ones is states and sort of centralized power. It's it's a fundamental conflict that created this country, and every time we have a major crisis, it's a question of what does the federal government say it needs in terms of, I guess, power and authority in order to resolve the crisis. I don't think it's a coincidence that every time, whether you're talking about the Union during the Civil War, or even FDR and the Allied forces during World War II, it's not a coincidence that the government always generally gets the power it needs in order to resolve the crisis. And there was something very interesting I was watching the other day. It was Teddy Roosevelt's great-grandson. He's a historian, and I believe he teaches at, I want to say Harvard, but quote me on that. One thing he talks about is that the Constitution and the republic we had during immediately following the Revolution, the Civil War actually started a separate republic after it. The rebelling states argued that they made the same argument that we initially made during the Revolution. And Lincoln actually was making a separate argument. I forget. I'll send you the link later.
I'm tracking with it though.
Yeah, and Cole again is a little bit more well versed on that one.
Well, that goes into how usually to solve the crisis, the solution creates new problems.
Right.
In the new order. We've had several, by the way, for all the tinfoil hat people who are big into Illuminati and the New World Order, we've had several new world orders. It just continues to happen.
Yeah. And I believe he pretty much says that individual rights, like we were saying, are basically put aside. They realize that they need a group that's sort of traditionally considered second class. We usually bring them into the fold, the winning faction. So during the Civil War, of course, it was Lincoln realizing that in order to win the war, that one way to do that is to deprive the South of its resources, and you do that by, of course, taking at the time what they considered to be their capacity to grow food
Hmm.
and really and for soldiers and all of that during World War II.
Right.
Again, they bring women. I think 60% of the people working in the factories were women. Uh, they bring, again, African Americans also into the military. And
When did they integrate the military? Was that FDR or Truman?
That was Truman. That was 1948.
Okay.
Yeah. But you see during this crisis sort of a preview of that, how they realize that if we just keep everyone we have as it is, we won't have enough to actually win this conflict. And so they're forced to bring other people into the fold in a way that they, don't beforehand. Now, I tended to think that this time it would be probably immigrants like doctors.
And what happens is you usually have these people who are brought into the fold, and when the crisis is done, they're like, hold up, I helped do this. I helped do that. The country owes me. There's a sense of healthy entitlement that I think the marginalized group develops, that creates movements like what started in 1954 with the Civil Rights Movement. I think that happened because we finally had a generation that was like, this is our country, we want in. So like full again, not a tale of two cities, not but equal, but we want in. So I think that's what will happen. Who knows what will happen in regards to immigrants this go around. I'm hesitant. We know who we're talking about as far as immigrants. I'm hesitant to put a rate on it, but
yeah. And so that's just one thing. I don't, because of the nature of this, and I'm on one hand, again, one part of this theory is that this crisis, it's always man-made. And so I'm a little hesitant to say, I've said on the group that I look at this as more of the creation of the environment that this crisis will happen within. I still think we could easily have a conflict with China, for instance. This administration is definitely pushing that.
Chinese virus.
Chinese virus. And he's still doing the whole dog whistle thing.
He did that for a couple of days, but then did he stop? I stopped watching.
He's still doing it. His a lot of people are going around. I mean, we're actually seeing a lot of news reports of people. Definitely in Maryland, there's been a couple cases of people just doing discriminatory things towards.
And it's all because of the fact that the briefings basically became, in my opinion, his campaign speech. It took the place of his town halls. He lost, I think, our current president, for those who see this in 2036, our current President Trump, that's what I'm talking about, benefits from being around the people in a town hall environment. And in the corona situation, social distancing, we don't have that. So therefore, it's my theory that he uses the daily briefings as his town hall. So he codes it. He puts in things to charge his fans. So,
and I mean he's been citing statistics on approval rating and all that stuff. So I don't want to take this too far into that, but just as far as talking about this crisis generally, I'm not sure that this is it. I know there's in the group we have a lot of discussion. I mean, even before this of is the crisis over yet?
Shoot, we're still talking about when it started. Is it 9/11? Is it Katrina? Is it
crash? And the way I look at it is I just look at the the bones of it, that every crisis there's high amount of deaths. That's something people like to talk about, but that's a factor that we can't really get away from. It was a feature of every major crisis before this, and so that's something I was looking out for. We now have that Granted, it's not a war.
But it's a moment that's killing every institution, like, or creating it's doing enough damage on every institution that there's going to be a before and after moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a reason to sort of reconstruct.
Yeah. It's putting up a mirror. It's basically, I see crisis not as like, ooh, gosh, the world's burning necessarily. I don't think it's like the end of the world, but I would call it, we relabeled the 1T, a recovery and a consensus. I see the crisis as a time for course correction, or
Right.
or maybe not even, I think the actual course correction happens in 1T, but I think we realize that we need course correction in the crisis. And
Right.
so this corona has basically affected every industry by saying, this is what the industry has represented for the last 80 years. Do you want to keep this industry, or do you want to change it? Do you want to continue to have movie theaters as the main exhibition platform for films?
Right.
Because right now all the theaters are closed, so now films are being forced to find other ways to get out there to the public. And I think the public is liking the new ways.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I think so too. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. There's definitely, I mean, this is definitely before and after type of where I don't think a lot of things are going to be the same after this. I don't see how they could be. There was one thing, I guess I could dip a little bit into the sort of political time stuff as it relates to, I guess, all of this. So
consider this an intro because I want a whole video on that.
yeah, I'd
I'll
have to do. Yeah. So, sort of in a nutshell, I'm not going to get too deep into it because I have to reread it myself. But
it's coming in. Corona's keeping it coming in tomorrow or this Monday. It'll probably be in June, but yeah.
So as far as like political time, it's a reference to 3 cycles. There's the cycle of polarization. There's constitutional rot, which is pretty much our norms breaking down, which we've had that for the past 4 years. And then finally, there's political regime change, which is defined as, they talk about critical elections, which is where you have somebody like, they would say right now we're in the Reagan era, the political regime, which is characterized by, again, sort of as policy.
Neoliberalism?
Yeah, basically. Before that, you have the New Deal and the civil rights political regime, which was started by FDR. Then before that, they have actually the Lincoln one lasting from 1860 through 1932. That's an extra long one. And they just sort of go back, and you notice that
before that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and before that, so you notice with those, Lincoln, FDR, Reagan, these are all,
We've only had a handful of presidents, really.
Right, right. And so political regime change happens usually following a crisis, usually following inadequate leadership. It happened after Carter, after Hoover, after Buchanan.
And Carter's a good guy. I mean, a good-natured guy.
Right.
But eras, movements, world views die.
Right.
It just happens. The New Deal was good, but you need a New Deal.
Yeah, and a big characteristic of it is that you can only have political regime change if, for example, let's use the FDR, the New Deal civil rights political regime as an example. That one starts, and in order for it to end, somebody of the same party has to essentially sort of bite the dust while they're pushing forward that ideology. They call this person a disjunctive president. So usually, Carter came in and said, I'm going to professionalize the federal government. He was viewed as sort of a new take on the Democrats. and he ended up being the last Democrat for 12 years. And the disjunctive is typically somebody who, again, it's discontinuous. They break from the administration or the president that started the current political regime. And so, yeah, right. And so, according to that, we would have to have a Republican president serve in that role in order to have a major critical election. Now, one part that confuses me a little bit with this is that, and it's the same thing with the 4T theory. There are like some discrepancies, and you don't know what exactly the source of it is. Before Lincoln, the Republican Party, it was a new party when Lincoln came into office. Before that, had the Whigs, but they had been out of power for 8 years before Lincoln came into office. Before FDR came into office, we had been out of power. There have been 3 presidents all through the 20s and into the early 30s. And so it's a question of how long does it take for, I guess, a party to reform and come up with a new platform, I guess.
I think it still goes back to generations, though. That's what I'm saying. It's basically cause and effect and life cycles.
Right.
Just people, unfortunately, dying off, and them and their opinions and their worldview dying off, leaving the way for something new to come in. So,
right. Yeah, it's that combined with
alignment,
not being in power for a long time.
Good point. Resets.
Yeah, a reset. Yeah, that's a way to look at it. And I don't know how long it takes to have that kind of reset. I don't know if 4 years is enough, to have.
But at the same time, if Reagan ushered in neoliberalism,
right,
and Trump is the not deconstructive. What is the name? Disjunctive president. You're saying that you don't know if 4 years is enough, which means you're saying Democrats haven't been out of the scene long enough. Right. That's why I think that it doesn't work to look at this with the labels of Democrat versus Republican. It's more like ideology, like neoliberalism.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying.
Progressives, you know what I mean? I'm not saying that's the way. I don't really want to push that right now. But I would honestly say if there was one type of worldview that has been told to sit down constantly, it's probably the progressive movement. It's the Bernie Sanders movement. It's the Occupy. Many of those movements have had to just wait while neoliberalism continued to control and take over ever since Lincoln. Reagan. And both Democrats and Republicans conformed to that ideology. However, the world seems to still want something new. It wants something progressive.
Right. And to that point, I'd say that that is true because, of course, the idea behind the theory is that, so it's the Reagan regime. Someone from the opposing party in, that person tends to try and work with it because they realize in Clinton's case, 12 years of Republicans in the White House, he finds a third way to sort of govern. And really same thing with the Obama administration. The major pieces of policy were really up the middle on that as far as healthcare, it being the old plan and all
incremental change.
Right.
And he could try to he could say that he wants to get us out of Iraq war all he wants, but he can't because we're stuck in that type of war. Under his administration, we were stuck in that type of war, which basically was paying for was a result of a lot of the things that happened in the 80s and the 90s.
Right.
In my opinion.
And I do want to point out that, so while I hear you on the neoliberalism thing, it is also true that following FDR. The Republicans, same thing. In that case, what we would define as a sort of a more progressive political regime. Republicans followed that, just like Democrats now, are really in line with the Reagan regime. So it's
Nixon was very great society.
Yeah,
Johnson
even
was officially great society, right? And Nixon.
So even with he created the EPA, for instance, we know that as far as creating, using government to solve problems, that wasn't something that Nixon or even Eisenhower was about doing. They knew that the political momentum was still in that direction towards using government to do things for civil rights and just exerting government power to get things done versus during the Reagan administration or the Reagan regime where government is bad. The scariest words you can hear is that I'm from the government, I'm here to help. There's this famous quote. And so you see this sort of going back and forth between a more, I guess, what we would call a more progressive regime and a more conservative regime. Although I'm thinking about the one following Lincoln, and I'm wondering.
They call it the progressive era. I don't even know if that's a good umbrella term for it.
Yeah, so some of the.
It's like an anomaly. McKinley, like who ushered in that era? Was it Roosevelt, Teddy, or was it McKinley? It's kind of a freak thing,
Right.
Maybe
and it's a little bit, and it's a little bit strange because with political time, with political regimes, they don't really actually argue that Teddy and McKinley, they didn't start a new regime. They argue that they continued the old one. That's one thing that I have to look a little bit more into. But so I'm stuck on the political regime stuff, but the other part of political time theory as a concept is that there are three big cycles. The political regime change is one of them. Polarization is another big one. And right now, looking at levels of polarization, we're at a spot that we haven't been in since polarization is the highest it's been since the Civil War. And as it relates to what we were talking about earlier with the with Strauss and Howe's theory of talking about crisis eras and crisis events, I'm curious to know how polarization affects the crisis, because World War II polarization was incredibly low during that time. And even afterwards, as Eisenhower was in office, I actually read a lot of research papers on policy making during that time. And there was almost no discernible difference between the voting records of Republicans and Democrats during that time. That doesn't mirror our time at all. I don't see that happening.
But that was the polarization during Lincoln's time.
It was high. So our time has a lot more in common with around the Civil War era, the 1850s, compared to, say, the 1920s and 30s, even though there are similarities in both. But just in terms of polarization as a concept, we're much more similar to, the 1850s in that regard. So I'm curious to know if this will have a lot more internal strife because of that similarity. And so just as we discuss, what a crisis looks like in the 21st century, and talking about how we, I think everybody has talked about how hard it is to see things devolving to the point where we have, war of really any kind. But just because of that factor of polarization, I'm not so sure that, especially with the tension between the states and the federal government right now in responding to the crisis, I'm sort of watching to see if that turns into something more conflictual.
Right.
Yeah. And so, and then
It seems to be, at first we were wondering if the Civil War, the Neil, or we're like the cold Civil War that we have is fueled by identity politics. But with Corona, it's going above identity politics. Corona doesn't care about identity.
Right.
But it's going back to the whole states' right issue. It's like we never really solved the problems of the Civil War era.
Right.
We're still dealing with that. So
yeah, and same thing. I mean, in a lot of ways, we can also look at this as a little bit of a continuation from the civil rights era, because New York Times, but a lot of different outlets, this was sort of the week for them to point out that they see that a lot of the hospitalizations and deaths really coming from communities of color. Reasons for that is that, of course, we know wealth is much, much lower in those communities. As government services are being shut down, they don't have access to a lot of the same services that people in, wealthier areas have. I mean, just in Baltimore, I've talked about it with my family a lot, but you can imagine it being the middle of the summer. And I know right now they're talking about the shutdown ending either at the end of May or as we go into May. But you can imagine that if the shutdown continued, people who, they go to the library, the cooling centers set up at libraries and different.
It's going to be like do the right thing with a virus.
Yeah. How would that work? Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And you just sit there and think in these, in these more urban areas and places that don't have as many resources, if you're telling people to stay home, but they don't have they don't have AC in their house, or the electricity goes out, or if there's a hurricane.
And meanwhile, they're jobless.
Yeah, and meanwhile, they're jobless. They'll get their check, but a lot of people won't be getting their checks until September. And so all that just combines into this mess where it's not hard.
One-time check, by the way. One-time check.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. It's not hard to imagine it turning into something where we could have a lot of
hot summer.
Yeah, hot summer, political violence.
Wasn't that, what was it? No, it was called Red Summer, right? Not hot summer, Red Summer. Wasn't it 19? It just, you and I like to make connections.
Yeah.
And it seems like we can't escape the Civil War era, the post-Civil War era. And right now we're dipping into a lot of the things that were bothering us, our country, around the post-World War I era.
Right.
We have the whole flag controversy. We have the virus.
Yeah.
Instead of flappers with from the 1920s, we get a virus.
Right.
we have Warren G. Harding as our president. That's my opinion.
Right.
You don't have to leave anything. You're in the political field. You don't say anything. You protect yourself. But we have Warren G. Harding as president. We may get another red summer.
Right.
What year was that? Was it 1917 or 18? I forgot.
That was 1920.
1920?
Yeah, or 1920.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah. So, I think of those sort of disparities that we already had, and this just accentuates it more and more. So if the response, is inadequate, then it's not hard to see certain states deciding to pull in one direction and the federal government pulling in another direction.
Right.
We had the thread in the group about Gavin Newsom.
Right.
The nation state phrase that he used to say that, California, ProPublica did an article on it. A lot of people are doing articles on the fact that a lot of these states have ordered supplies, and the supplies gets intercepted by the federal government. And then they give them, instead of getting 500 units of something, they'll get 100 units of something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not hard to imagine, starting with California because their economy can, sort of afford it.
And that doesn't go back to our normal. I'm not taking away the legitimate. I'm not taking away the importance of the identity politics because I believe that's very important, and I've had lots of debates over that. But there are a lot of people who are like, it's about the economy, stupid, who don't really consider the whole equality thing as an important issue to fight over during the crisis period. But if we're talking about what you're saying with California, that just like it sums it all up.
Yeah. I mean, really, you could almost look at a state as sort of like a case study in this to say that, if you look in certain states and you break it down by, socioeconomic class or whatever, you see the deaths are starting to bear that out. And it's a question of people, is there going to be a competing narrative that the federal government is looking out for certain people or certain states and not others? And again, it's not hard in a super polarized atmosphere, again, in the heat of the summer, that there could be some type of, conflict between states and the federal government.
And who knows what the narrative is going to be, because honestly, the narrative is written after the fact by the victor.
Yeah, that's right.
Which goes back to the 14th theory, a flaw in the 14th theory.
Yeah, right.
How are we really analyzing the previous turn-ins? What point of view?
Yeah.
Are the authors basically putting their bias of the generations and the historical moments into it?
Right.
Is it a good way to wrap it up and then have a part two? Realize it's full circle.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about this literally for another hour. So yeah, we might want to kind of tie a bow on it. And so, so I talk about political regime change, polarization, and then the last piece is constitutional rot, which is essentially just our norms, traditions, all of that stuff. They start to break down, and again, that's really high right now.
Right.
Yeah. And so polarization is high and constitutional rot is high. And the main part of the theory and sort of the phase we're going into now is that it's hard to switch political regimes when polarization is high and when constitutional rot is high.
We've never talked about that.
No, we haven't talked about that.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so that's why normally in past crises, you get your Hoover or whoever, and it's typically one term of a bad president from the party
Buchanan,
in charge of the regime right now. This is different because apparently it's going to be hard to shift to another political regime because of where we are.
So there's a convergence of all the theories, but at the same time, there's an anomaly in all the theories.
Right. Yeah. There's
theory in itself is in crisis right now.
Yeah, we don't know because, I mean, one huge thing is we're talking 80, 90-year spans. Even with political regimes, you're talking about like 40 years at a time. We only have so many to look back at. And that's one tough part of sort of making definitive statements about generations and crises because the sample size is small in political science. So it's hard.
So young. It's really young.
Yeah.
We could say that the crisis before Revolutionary War was a glorious revolution, but that was like basically a crisis that took place in two continents, two countries.
Right.
I mean, I guess we had battles with the terrorists at that time with the natives. So,
right. And so, yeah. And so it's just hard to tell. We know we're coming into, and to kind of put it all together, I mean, Neil Howe, he says he put out articles recently that, definitively this is going to be the decade that's super tumultuous and that mimics the 1940s or the 1860s. And it's the same thing with the political time theory. They say we're entering a span of 5 to 10 years that are going to be, again, very tumultuous. We'll make it out of it, but we don't know for sure what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. That we've gone through similar times in the past and that we always make it out. But sort of the value of this theory here, especially if you're an observer of history or politics, is, it's like a big blinking sign to pay attention to what's going on right now.
Mm-hmm. Not fear. There have been several end of the worlds.
Yep. Yeah, like every decade there's a theory that, the world's going to end because this horrible thing is happening right now. And that, it happens pretty often.
But the only thing we have to fear is...
Yeah, is fear itself. So that's sort of two in a nutshell. I skipped over some things, but we'd be sitting there for a very long time.
Well, I think we need a part 2.
Yeah, we do.
So part 2, political time theory. Yeah. All right. I think I'm going to sign off. But this is very good. This is very good.
All right.
Thank you. We've been trying to do this for a while, and we finally did it, and we're going to do it again. Probably, in a couple days. So.
Yeah, that's fine. We got plenty to talk about.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to hit the stop button, and then we'll talk. We'll have a little post-mortem after this.
All right. Great.